Believe it or not, I didn't always want to be a rabbi. I know it's hard to believe. I'm sure every one of you grew up wanting only to be a rabbi, fireman being only a distant second choice. But I didn't always want to. And believe it or not, what I wanted to be at one point in my life was an academic, a researcher. And my field was linguistics, languages. So I've always had a certain fascination for languages, sometimes to my detriment, even though everyone likes languages to some extent. When you start talking about it for too long, people get a little bit bored. But I hope that today I won't be boring anybody, because I want to give you an insight into the nature of communication, which is something I really only understood after I stopped studying linguistics in university and started studying the Torah and what the Torah has to say about communication. The real, I guess, paradox or problem with language and linguistics in general is that we're trying to communicate thoughts. We have ideas. And ideas are not things in the sense that they're not physical, they're not in front of us. It's not a thing and I just show it to you and that's it. An idea is something that exists in my mind. It's something that I think. And I want to communicate it to you. That means I want to somehow transplant that idea from my mind into your mind. And we're not talking necessarily about rarefied ideas here. I mean any kind of idea. The idea like, I'd like that window to be closed, please. Right? So I'd like to communicate that idea to you. So I take my thought and I translate it into words. Those words come out. And hopefully, if we're on the same level in terms of our communication, or you understand that what that means is you reconstruct those words in your head as a thought, meaning, he wants me to close that window and you walk over and do me the favor of closing the window. That's ideal communication. Now, the simpler the thought, the easier it is to produce that chain of effective communication. But with more complicated thoughts, it becomes much more complicated, sometimes even impossible. And we all know that feeling when there's an idea or concept you want to express and you just don't have the words. Right? It's stuck in your head. You know exactly what it is you want to say, and there's just no words for it. There's just no way to explain it. So this means that, paradoxically, true communication is really impossible. Now, how exactly this works and why it is so is something which we can understand a little bit more about by examining the story which I'm sure most of you know, the story of the Tower of Babel. So what happened there, according to Torah, is that the mankind decided as a whole to rebel against God. Whatever it means, all these things have deep meanings. Nobody thought that they were really going to build a big tower and go up and attack God, with swords up in his throne in the clouds. That's ridiculous. Sometimes, by the way, we have to get rid of these ridiculous ideas that we grew up with. They're okay for kindergarten children, for 5-year-olds learning exactly, what did it look like in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were running around with little, loincloths made out of fig leaves or something like that. We sometimes have to understand that those ideas were fine for kids, but if the Torah is as we say it is, the wisdom of God Almighty Himself, then surely there must be deeper things to be discovered. So that means when we're discussing the Tower of Babel, so we have to understand that nobody really thought that they could climb up to the sky and attack God, and dethrone God. It's patently ridiculous. They had some other idea. They wanted to team up, as it were, use their human resources to somehow rebel against God. Now's not the time to discuss exactly what that was. The commentaries say that God thwarted their plan by doing what? Well, the Torah says clearly that He decided to mix up their language. So how did we understand that when we were growing up, going to Sunday school, going to Hebrew school? So we understood that means that everybody spoke Hebrew. And then what happened was God said, well, now you speak French, and you speak Spanish, and you speak Italian, and you speak Portuguese, and you speak Zulu, and now you can't understand each other. So the commentators say, what happened? The story goes like this. Man A was busy doing the building, and man B was passing him his tools. So man A asked man B, please pass me a hammer. And man B didn't understand him because he said it in Portuguese, whereas he really spoke Mandarin Chinese. So he handed him the wrong tool, a chisel. And the man got upset with him. A chisel? I didn't want a chisel, I wanted a hammer. And from that ensued arguments and they ended up killing each other. Now let me ask you, if the story really means that they spoke one language and now they spoke different languages, how difficult would it be for somebody to just learn the word for hammer in Portuguese? Or Mandarin Chinese? Or just point and say, Clearly that's not what's going on over here. So the explanation is that what God did, just think about it. God could have stopped them building the tower anyway. He could have brought a big plague. He's God, right? So God can do whatever he wants. Kind of axiomatic to, believing in an all-powerful God is that he's all-powerful. He can do whatever he wants. So that means he could stop them. He could just say, from now on, this tower is going to fall down every time it reaches 100 feet. And that's it. It'll fall down. But no, he did it in a certain way. What did he do? He took away the power of communication from them. So our deeper sources say that communication before this Tower of Babel was communication of ideas. It means a person could say something to another person, and in a mystical way, we're not necessarily able to understand exactly how that worked, but the thought was transferred from my head to his head. He knew what I meant. There was no potential for misunderstanding. There was no way that you could misunderstand what the person wanted. Now that they could misunderstand each other, so now there was a potential for infighting. Similarly, we find in the story of Moses and Aaron, Moshe, the great leader of the Jewish people, Torah says that he had a speech impediment. He found it difficult to express things. The words in the Torah, Loi ish devarim anoichi. I'm not a man of words. Not a man of words. So God says, don't worry, Aaron will be your spokesman. Hu yiyeh lecha lepeh. He will be for you as a mouth. So again, we understand Moses had a stammer or a stutter, and Aaron was to be his interpreter. Again, that's a very facile interpretation. Of course, it's true, the Torah says Moses had trouble speaking. But why was that? What does it mean, I am not a man of words? So our commentators explain that what it means is that Moses was on such a high level, his thoughts were so rarefied and so dignified and so up there in terms of spirituality that he had trouble bringing them down into the physical world. He had trouble expressing them because they were so lofty. And to bring them into the miasma of our physical, lowly world just wasn't possible for him. He couldn't translate from the one to the other. By the way, we have a principle that if a person wants to understand deeper spirituality, he has to look at the human body. Look at the human body. A verse in the Torah says that I can see spirituality from my body. What does that mean? It means that God created us in a way that if we know how to look, we can understand deep things. Why is the mouth over here? So above the mouth, you have the eyes, you have the ears, you have the brain. Why? Because those higher faculties are all higher faculties, right? Moving down. The lower, baser physical functions of the body are down below. The bridge, the intermediary, the interface between those things is the mouth. It's no accident. I take thoughts which are from the brain, and I'm trying to bring them down into the physical. They have to come through the mouth, which is the interface. Which is why Aaron was going to be the mouth. The verse says, he's the mouth. He will be your mouth. He would be that interface through which Moses would be able to communicate, would be able to bring those ideas into the world. So what are we to make of this? We live in a world, according to what I'm saying, where true communication is impossible. It's impossible for me to communicate exactly to anybody exactly what it is that I'm thinking. There's no such thing as mind reading. So what's the point? What's the point in even attempting? True connection with someone is not possible. He can never really understand me. My entire life, when I try to communicate with someone, or I try and even explain this concept to you that as I'm doing now, it's not possible. It's one great Sisyphean task which is doomed to failure. Why bother? The answer is, and this is very, very important for everyone to remember in their lives, in their spiritual development and in other development, although all real development is spiritual development, just because it's impossible doesn't mean I shouldn't try. Just because it's impossible doesn't mean I shouldn't try. Life is about realizing that perfection is not attainable. Real perfection, that's for God. It's not for us. We're humans. We're composites of body and soul. We're made up of body and soul. In case you haven't noticed, this physical body that we're clad in looks quite a bit like a monkey's body. We have that element to us. But we also have a divine soul in us. So we're an inbuilt contradiction. That's difficult, but it's something we have to live with. And that very challenge, that challenge of knowing that even though I can't, I am not God, and I can never understand truly, absolutely everything. As one of our classic philosophy sources, the Kuzari, says, if I could understand God, I would be Him. It's not possible to understand 100%. But does that mean we don't try? Does that mean we don't attempt to understand every single thing? No, Jews throughout history have placed such an emphasis on learning, on knowing, on appreciating the fine distinctions between things in life. Why? Because that brings us closer and closer to the divine. It brings us closer to that level of spirituality. It brings us closer and closer to that level of being able to communicate pristinely or to relate to things in their true essence. And that's an inspiring thought. There have been and there still are religious systems, spiritual systems, which idealize this human incapacity. We can never understand God. We can't understand how things really work. So therefore we'll just take it all on faith. Blind faith, that's it. And the more blind faith I have, the better. That is not Judaism. Ours is a very different path. Our path is to realize that we can and should try to understand more. If God gave us a brain, and God gave us an intellect, and God gave us a mind, then He wants us to use them. He wants us to try and appreciate more and more and more, and to spend our lives coming closer and closer to what is true and what is right. To fail, to fall, is human. But more human than that is to get up again and keep trying. The famous Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who wasn't Jewish, he was 3/4 Jewish, but the wrong 3/4. But he himself considered himself to be very, very Jewish. He said once that his thoughts were 100% those of the Hebrew. So he had a certain fondness for the Jewish people. In any event, he once said that the task of philosophy was to teach the fly trapped in the bottle to look up. I think that's a perfect metaphor for spirituality in general. That the whole idea is that, yes, to some extent, flies are trapped in a bottle. What does a fly do? It buzzes around, it can't get up, because it forgets to look up. So we should walk around with our heads looking up. That means to realize that even though, yes, it's true, we may never attain perfection, but the process of trying, the journey, is not necessarily just for the destination. The process of learning, of understanding, of going through life trying to improve ourselves, that's it. That's life. Maybe the most famous exponent of this idea that the world cannot be understood and we should just have faith, and that the more blind faith we have, the less sense it makes, the more we'll be rewarded, was the philosopher Kierkegaard, who wrote a whole book about the binding of Isaac, about how it didn't make any sense, and therefore it was the most sublime act of human faith. We say no. So we need to understand how Jews understand and relate to the story of the binding of Isaac. But suffice it to say, we deal with it, we relate to it in a way of trying to understand, trying to resolve the contradictions. The very first thing, as soon as God, the angel of God, told Abraham to stay his hand, that this is never what he wanted, the first thing that Abraham said to him, he said, well, now explain to me what's going on over here. I want to know, I want to understand. I want to understand, I want to know. Our job as Jews is to try and bridge that gap as much as possible between what we know, what we understand, and what's up there, what's ununderstandable. We want to get towards the incomprehensible as much as possible to narrow that gap. What was for Kierkegaard one giant leap, for Jews should be one small step.